I've said this many times throughout my life, and it wasn't by accident. When I talk about investment, many people immediately think of money, numbers, visible financial decisions. But the most expensive mistake I've seen people make with money almost never starts with money. It starts before that, in how they think, in their rush for results, and mainly in how they underestimate the impact of small decisions repeated over time. Over decades of observing all kinds of people, I noticed something curious. Most don't lose money due to lack of intelligence. They lose it because of behavior. Smart, hardworking, well-intentioned people end up trapped in cycles that drain energy, time, and resources without realizing they're paying too high a price for seemingly small decisions. That's the most expensive mistake I've seen repeated. It doesn't appear all at once. It settles in slowly, almost politely, until it becomes part of the routine. I learned early that humans are extremely good at explaining to themselves why a bad decision makes sense in the moment. I've done it too. The difference is that over time, I began to observe this pattern from a distance. I saw people saying they had no choice, when in fact they had just gotten used to choosing the most comfortable path in the short term, and immediate comfort tends to charge high interest in the future, even if nobody calls it that. Many people believe that the biggest financial problem in life is earning too little. Of course, income matters, but that's not where the most expensive mistake lies. I've seen people increase their salary multiple times and remain in the same place, or even in a worse situation. The problem wasn't how much came in, but what they automatically did with what came in. Decisions made on autopilot are dangerous because they don't seem like decisions. They just seem like habits. There's a huge difference between spending money and deciding to spend money. When the decision isn't conscious, it's almost never good. Throughout my life, I've observed that most people treat money as something emotional. When they feel tired, they spend to relieve. When they feel frustrated, they spend to compensate. When they feel hopeful, they spend betting that everything will work out. Money becomes an extension of mood, and not a tool considered calmly. The most expensive mistake I've seen is exactly this: using money as emotional anesthesia. This doesn't appear as a big disaster all at once. It manifests in small installments, recurring decisions, convincing justifications. The person says they deserve it, that they worked hard, that they'll get organized later. And I understand this reasoning. It's human. But it's also dangerous, because later rarely comes when now is always stronger. Throughout my experience, I realized that people drastically underestimate the power of repetition. An isolated mistake rarely destroys someone. What hurts is repeating the same mistake with small variations for years, believing it's harmless. It's like a silent leak. It makes no noise, draws no attention, but when someone notices, it has already caused considerable damage. I've seen many people focus too much on big decisions and completely ignore the small ones. They want to know the right moment, the perfect choice, the life turnaround. Meanwhile, every day they make predictable decisions that move in the opposite direction. It's not lack of information, it's excess hope that a big future decision will compensate for a series of small bad decisions in the present. I learned, observing all this, that the long term is not just a matter of time. It's a matter of sustained behavior. It doesn't help to know what to do if you can't repeat that behavior when nobody's watching, when there's no excitement, when the decision seems boring. The most expensive mistake is almost always abandoning what works because it seems too slow. People tend to overestimate what they can change in a year and underestimate what they can change in 10. This mismatch creates frustration. Frustration leads to impulsive decisions. And impulsive decisions are fertile ground for the most expensive mistake I'm describing. It's not a dramatic mistake. It's a silent, comfortable, and socially accepted mistake. Throughout my life, I learned to distrust decisions that seemed too good to relieve immediate tension. When something promises to quickly solve financial or emotional discomfort, it usually charges a hidden price. And that price is almost always paid in the future, when the person is already too tired to react clearly. The curious thing is that, looking back, the mistake seems obvious. But at the moment it happens, it comes well dressed, with reasonable arguments and support from other people who do exactly the same thing. This creates a false sense of normality. If everyone does it, it seems safe. Over the years, I've learned that everyone does it is rarely a good criterion for important decisions. At this point, I want to bring a simple example to illustrate what I'm saying. Impulse is like scratching an insect bite. It relieves in the moment, but almost always gets worse afterward. When you feel the need to make a quick decision to respond to an immediate desire, it may bring you momentary relief. But in the long run, the effect is like an itch that won't go away. It only gets worse. And in the end, you pay the price for not giving yourself time to think. In this first part, I wanted to make clear that the most expensive mistake I've seen isn't technical, isn't complex, and doesn't require graphs to be understood. It stems from common human behavior, from hurry, from the search for immediate relief, and from the difficulty of thinking in decades when the day is already too heavy. In the next part, I'll talk more deeply about how this mistake manifests in daily life, why it's so difficult to perceive while it's happening, and how most people react exactly in the way. That makes it even more expensive as time passes. Throughout my life, I've learned that the most expensive mistake rarely reveals itself clearly while it's happening. It doesn't arrive as a shock. It arrives as routine, and everything that becomes routine stops being questioned. When something repeats enough, it starts to seem inevitable, almost natural, even when it's clearly working against you. This mistake begins to show itself in everyday life, in decisions made when energy is already depleted. At the end of a long day, after dealing with work, problems, responsibilities, and expectations, few people still have the disposition to reflect calmly. The brain wants rest, not analysis. And at that moment, deciding quickly seems like a way to alleviate the weight of the day. The problem is that relieving the present often costs dearly in the future. I've seen people say they would get organized when the situation improved. Then they would say they just needed a little more breathing room. Then they would say that it wasn't the right moment. The context changed, but the pattern remained. Money came in and went out with the same speed, and the feeling of always being behind never disappeared. The mistake wasn't in the lack of effort. It was in the repetition of decisions made without awareness. Over time, I realized that most people don't fail due to ignorance. They fail due to fatigue. Fatigue from deciding, fatigue from resisting impulse, fatigue from thinking about the long term when the short term already seems too heavy. That's why so many bad decisions are made at night, on weekends, or right after a difficult day. Not because they are good decisions, but because they seem easier at that moment. Another aspect that I frequently observed is silent comparison. People look around and feel they're falling behind. Someone seems to be living better, spending more, enjoying more. Even without realizing it, this creates pressure to keep up with a pace that wasn't consciously chosen. When someone starts spending, to not feel excluded, money stops being a tool and becomes an emotional response. This type of decision rarely brings lasting satisfaction. It brings quick relief, followed by a return to the same point as before, sometimes a bit worse. Gradually, the brain learns that spending relieves discomfort, and anything that relieves discomfort tends to be repeated. This is how the most expensive mistake strengthens, not through force, but through repetition. Over the decades, I noticed that financially more stable people share a simple habit. They create a small space between impulse and action, not because they are cold or calculating, but because they learn that not every desire needs to be immediately fulfilled. They allow themselves to wait. Wait to cool down. Wait to think. Wait to perceive if that decision still makes sense after the emotion passes. Most people do exactly the opposite. They decide quickly to get rid of the discomfort of deciding. This creates a sense of efficiency, but charges a silent price. Each impulsive decision leaves a residue, a future commitment, a recurring concern, a smaller margin to deal with unforeseen events. In isolation, this seems small. Added up over the years, it becomes heavy. I've also seen many people confuse movement with progress. They're always adjusting something, changing plans, trying to fix the now. This gives a sense of control, but true control rarely comes from constant changes. It comes from a few well-thought-out decisions that don't need to be remade every week. The most expensive mistake appears when someone lives trying to fix the present without ever building the future. There's a common belief that overthinking hinders, but the problem was never overthinking. The problem is thinking only about the now. Thinking with emotional distance, with patience, is rare. And precisely because it's rare, it creates advantage. Most people don't do this because it seems slow, unexciting, almost boring. But boring decisions often prove to be the most effective in the long run. Another pattern I've observed is treating financial decisions as tests. If it goes wrong, try something else. In some aspects of life this might work, but with money, it's usually expensive. Each attempt has a cost, and more importantly, it teaches the brain that there are no lasting consequences. Over time, this weakens responsibility and strengthens impulse. The most expensive mistake also feeds on the idea that there's still time, and in most cases, there is. But this feeling creates postponement. The person believes they can fix it later. The problem is that later usually comes with less energy, less margin, and more fatigue. Time keeps passing regardless of intention. I've learned by observing that people who manage to break this pattern aren't special. They make mistakes too. The difference is that they make the same mistake fewer times. They learn quickly from small slips and adjust their behavior before the problem grows. Most people do the opposite. They persist until the mistake becomes too big to ignore. There's something curious about all this. The most expensive mistake is, in most cases, avoidable. It doesn't require extraordinary talent or rare opportunities. It only requires willingness to tolerate a little discomfort now to avoid a much greater burden later. This goes against many basic human impulses. Perhaps that's why it's so difficult. Throughout my life, I've noticed that talking about this mistake bothers some people because it doesn't point to clear external villains. It doesn't blame the system, the economy, or bad luck. It invites looking inward at repeated patterns, at choices made without reflection, and this invitation isn't always comfortable. But I've also seen something important. When someone finally recognizes this pattern, the feeling isn't guilt, but relief. Relief from understanding that they weren't lacking intelligence or luck. They lacked clarity and time. Clarity to see the behavior. Time to allow better decisions to take effect. In the next part, I want to close this conversation in a practical and reflective way. I'll talk about how to weaken this mistake in daily life, not with rigid rules or quick promises, but with simple, realistic, and sustainable mental adjustments. Nothing spectacular, just the kind of change that stands the test of time. Throughout my life, I've concluded that weakening the most expensive mistake doesn't require extraordinary willpower. It requires, above all, repeated clarity. Not the clarity that comes in moments of inspiration, but that which builds gradually when you begin to recognize your own patterns without trying to fight them heroically. Most people fail because they try to change everything at once. Changes that last almost always start small. The first real adjustment is accepting that impulse won't disappear. It's part of human nature. Expecting that one day you'll simply stop feeling the urge to decide quickly is a trap. What works is learning to live with the impulse without immediately obeying it. When you understand this, your relationship with money begins to change. Not because you've become another person, but because you've created distance between feeling and action. I've always seen this distance as a form of respect for one's own future. It's not denial, it's not rigidity. It's just an interval, a short but powerful space where emotion loses some of its strength and reason gains a voice. Many bad decisions only exist because there wasn't this interval. When it appears, the most expensive mistake begins to lose ground. I also learned that simplifying is a huge advantage. The more complex the attempt at control, the more fragile it becomes when life tightens. People who build stability don't depend on sophisticated systems. They depend on a few clear principles repeated with consistency. Simple decisions, applied many times, often beat brilliant decisions that aren't sustainable. Another important point is to stop treating money as an isolated subject. It's deeply connected to energy, rest, stress, and expectations. When someone is exhausted, they make worse decisions. When pressured, they accept solutions too quickly. Understanding this changes how you judge yourself. Instead of blaming yourself, you begin to observe yourself. And calm observation is much more effective than constant guilt. I've seen many people improve their financial trajectory without earning more money, simply because they started making fewer mistakes at predictable moments. End of day, extreme fatigue, comparison with others, accumulated frustration. These moments aren't surprises. They repeat themselves. And precisely because they repeat, they can be treated with more care. Not with perfection, but with attention. One of the most powerful changes I've ever observed is swapping the question, "Is this allowed?" for "Will this make sense to me in a few years?" This simple switch changes the horizon. The decision stops being about now and becomes about continuity. Few things stand up well to this type of question, and those that do are usually worth it. I've also learned that the long term doesn't require rush. It requires persistence. People often abandon good decisions because they seem not to yield quick results. But almost everything that really matters grows slowly. The most expensive mistake takes advantage of impatience. It strengthens when someone gives up too early on what works and returns to what is comfortable in the short term. Over time, I realized that financial stability isn't about absolute control. It's about margin. Margin to make mistakes without breaking. Margin to deal with unforeseen events. Margin to think calmly when something unexpected happens. This margin doesn't come from big moves, but from the continuous reduction of impulsive decisions that silently drain resources. There's also an important shift when someone starts to see money as a consequence, not a solution. It reflects choices, habits, and priorities. When you try to use money to solve problems that are emotional, social, or related to fatigue, it always loses. When you take care of these other areas, money tends to behave better without much extra effort. If I had to summarize everything I've seen into one central idea, it would be this. The most expensive mistake isn't making a mistake. It's not realizing you've been making the same mistake for a long time. When this realization emerges, even if slowly, it's already a sign of change. Not because everything will improve at once, but because the pattern has begun to be questioned. I like to end these reflections with simple images because they stick. So I leave one that summarizes all this well. Impulse is like scratching a bite. It relieves in the moment, but almost always worsens later. The itch passes if you wait. The damage diminishes if you don't react immediately. With money, something very similar happens. Quick relief charges a silent price. Waiting, although uncomfortable, usually costs less. Throughout my life, I've learned to value decisions that seem unexciting, but withstand time. They don't yield impressive stories, but they build something much more valuable, tranquility. And tranquility, over the years, transforms into freedom. Not the kind sold in quick promises, but the freedom of not always reacting, running, fixing. If you take only one thing from this conversation, let it be this. Paying attention to your own behavior is already a huge step. Not to demand more of yourself, but to get in your own way less. Money responds well when we stop treating it on impulse and start treating it with a little more patience. I intend to continue thinking aloud about these topics in the simplest and most honest way I know, because I believe that shared clarity helps more than sold shortcuts. If you want to continue learning with me, subscribe and keep following along.